1999, adopted the Marine Life Protection Act, which required a proactive approach to conserving ocean wildlife and habitat. Under this new law, which is called the MLPA, for Marine Life Protection Act, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the California Fish and Game Commission were tasked with engaging scientific experts and coastal citizens to help design a system of underwater parks. The Marine Life Protection Act's design principles are a bit like Noah's Ark, where they required the final network of protection to include replicates of all key ocean and coastal habitats in our state. In the second webinar, we focused on the science of MPAs, and in that we had guests Dr. Mark Carr, and Dr. Jan Frywald. In that webinar, many of you may have heard about how marine protected areas are working around the world, from the tropics to the cold waters of the Arctic, and are providing a variety of benefits to local communities, economies, and fishermen over time. We heard about the specific science guidelines that were adopted, things like the size and spacing and representation of different habitats that was used to design California's network. We learned that recovery takes time. We need patience, and that our expectations about recovery will depend on the level of protection, the amount of commercial and recreational extraction, and the condition of a particular place. Finally, we heard firsthand about the research that's going on by the Monitoring Enterprise and PISCO, where scientists are documenting the response of MPAs to protection, and also citizen groups and citizen monitoring programs like Reef Check to help us understand how our MPAs are responding to added protection. And today, our third in our series of webinars, we have the honor of having two special guests. Mike Sutton, current president of the California Fish and Game Commission, who worked tirelessly throughout the MLPA design stage as both an advocate and a decision maker. He is currently the vice president for the Pacific Flyway at the National Audubon Society, and he's going to get us started. And Nicole Lampe, who leads the Oceans program at Resource Media. This is a nonprofit communications firm that focuses on resource policy. Nicole has worked on MPAs on the West Coast and internationally for over 6 years, and Resource Media has been helping to raise awareness about California's MLPA Act for nearly a decade. This afternoon, we're going to focus on communicating about marine protected areas. First, we're going to hear from Mike about why it's important that you, your organization, community members, and maybe your constituents should be aware of marine protected areas. Then we're going to hear from Nicole on how you communicate. She's going to provide some talking points and messaging on what resonates with the public. What do people understand about communicating about marine protected areas? We hope that you'll enjoy this afternoon's webinar. My name is Ricky Dunsmore, and I work with the California Marine Sanctuary Foundation. At this time, we're putting all of the participants, except for the speakers, on mute. Only the presenter should be audible. We, however, definitely want to hear from you, and we ask that you private chat your questions. That's in the bottom right hand of your screen to Danielle Brown at any time during the presentation. And we will take some time at the end of the webinar for follow-up. With that, thank you all for joining us, and I'm going to hand over to Mike.
Well, thank you, Ricky, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining. My name, again, is Mike Sutton, president of the California Fish and Game Commission, and I'm really delighted to be here this afternoon. Let me just start by saying how proud I am and how proud I hope you all are that California now, as a result of the last decade's worth of work, has the nation's largest network of marine reserves. There are larger marine reserves in the Pacific. Some of you may have heard the news this week that President Obama is vastly expanding the size and scope of some of the marine reserves in the Pacific. But here in California, we have the nation's largest network of reserves, and what that means is we have a biologically functioning system of marine protected areas of various kinds along the California coast for 800 miles that is the largest in the nation. and it represents a huge leap forward from what we had just a decade ago. Well, we didn't get there by accident. You've heard in the last two webinars, many of you, how we got to where we are today, and I suspect that many of you share the scar tissue that those of us involved in the process have from the incredible journey that it's been. But we have these marine protected areas because people cared. People cared enough about our oceans to become involved in the public process. And that really goes for all Californians. When I worked at the Monterey Bay Aquarium as the head of conservation, I realized that something like 85% of Californians have been to the aquarium. People in California love our coast. They want to see it protected. There's a tremendous latent public support for what you all are doing and for what we're trying to do here. So only by working in partnership with everyone involved can we really make these areas work. That's our challenge now. Let me start, though, with a kind of an anecdote. When we started or tell a brief story, that when we started the Marine Life Protection Act initiative, we did some focus groups in different parts of the state to better understand how Californians react to their ocean and gauge their support for marine protected areas. And I'll never forget, I went to a focus group in Riverside down in Southern California. I do that occasionally just to keep finger on the pulse of what Californians are thinking about our ocean. And there were men and women there that evening, and I was behind a one-way mirror. It's how you watch a focus group. And the interviewer was saying, well, what do you think about, what's the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about a marine protected area? And one of the guys spoke up and said, oh, yeah, you mean Camp Pendleton, an area protected by the Marines, right? Well, that sort of gave me the impression that, it's kind of a wake-up call, if you will, that, a lot of people just don't get what a marine protected area is, and they don't understand what the concept is. Everybody knows what a national park is on land, maybe a state park, wildlife refuge, so forth. The jurisdictional boundaries are confusing enough on land, but when you get to the ocean, people have no clue what the National Marine Sanctuary is, or a state park, or a national park that includes seawater, or a marine reserve. The governance structure that we've constructed in the United States is so confusing that you can't blame people for thinking that a marine reserve is Camp Pendleton. So we have a ways to go at helping people understand what marine protected areas are, marine reserves, and why they're important. But let me give you an example of what I think of when I think of what we did in the Marine Life Protection Act and why it's important to people. This is Point Lobos here on the Monterey Peninsula where I live, and maybe I'm a little biased, but I think in all my travels around the world that Point Lobos is one of the most beautiful places in the world where the ocean meets the land. And it's been protected for years as a state park on land, but only recently did we extend protections out into the ocean through the MLPA process, and now there's a marine reserve and a state marine conservation area right off of Point Lobos. So what we've essentially done is achieved ridges to reefs protection. We've gone all the way from the uplands, the highlands, to the coast, to the offshore reefs and kelp beds and so forth. So we've achieved comprehensive protection for an entire terrestrial and marine ecosystem. Well, that's important to the 400,000 people that visit Point Lobos every year. They're drawn by the stunning beauty and access to nature on land, but many of them don't know. They don't have a clue that the marine life offshore is similarly protected, or maybe they assume that it is, but just don't know how. Of course, it lies within the boundaries of the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, but a lot of people don't know what that means either. So part of our job is simply to help people understand that it's important not just to protect the land where we live, but the rest of the planet, the other 70% of the planet that's saltwater, and that's important to sea otters, that's important to birds, that's important to people and fish and marine mammals and all the things that they care about. So taking advantage of people's interest in places like Point Lobos is a way to, and their interest in doing things there, tide pooling and birding and hiking and picnicking, is a way to generate their attention to their focus on the marine environment as well. So every visit to our shore is an opportunity to connect with people, to introduce them to the wonders of the ocean, the tide, the intertidal, the coastline, highlight the importance of protecting our ocean because, as Ricky said before and as you've heard, if we don't care about the ocean, then nobody's going to bother to protect it. And if you leave it up to the agencies like the Commission or the Department of Fish and Wildlife or the federal agencies. We know that no offense to our agency colleagues, but frankly, we do that at our peril. If people don't care about our oceans, we can't depend on the agencies alone to do that for us. So it's really important that the community, take ownership of these areas themselves. And we do that through a number of ways. I mean, you've all seen these signs: no dumping, drains to the ocean. Well, that's on it's emblazoned on every storm drain in the Monterey Peninsula, and a lot of them in San Francisco as well, and elsewhere in the state. Well, that's a way to get people to understand that, if you dump your engine oil down a storm drain, it's going to end up in the ocean, and it makes that connection. That's really helpful to people because it gives folks an opportunity to care, do something in their own lives to make a difference. One of my favorite programs at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and maybe yours too, is the Seafood Watch program that developed and marketed these wallet cards, red, green, and yellow, giving consumers an opportunity to make choices when they visit a seafood restaurant or a retail store to help take care of the oceans by making the right choice and choosing seafood that's from well-managed fisheries. Well, that's become so popular now that there's something like 50 million of those Seafood Watch cards on the street, and there's even an app for your iPhone or your Android phone, so you can be a really boring dinner companion and tell all your friends what they shouldn't eat. But it's so popular because it's an opportunity for people to act in their own lives to make a difference, and we humans like that. It's why recycling is so popular. We don't trust the politicians much. We may not trust our government to do the right thing, but we love doing the right thing in our own lives, and we can use that to help heighten people's awareness about the oceans, because the more people understand about the oceans, the more pressure they'll put on their elected and appointed officials, and the better decisions we'll be able to make. It's all about promoting responsible use of our oceans. People who visit the coast, which, again, as most Californians, I don't know about you, but I'd rather be in Monterey at this time of year than Bakersfield or Fresno. Because it's too hot there. And so people come to the coast. They flock to the coast at this time of year by the thousands. And they come to aquariums and they see signs like this and they go to the beach, and they're not happy when the beach is closed because of a pollution event or whatnot. But we owe them everything we can do to help them understand the special importance of the place they're visiting and how to take care of it. Well, getting back to marine protected areas, I imagine many of you were involved in the elaborate public process that led up to the MLPA being implemented. The MLPA, as you may have heard in previous webinars, was adopted by the legislature, signed by the governor about 1999 and the end of the last decade. It took a decade to implement properly, maybe more than that. The state made 2 attempts to do it by themselves and failed both times because of insufficient public engagement. So it finally took an innovative public-private partnership to provide sufficient funding to the state to allow the state to initiate a groundbreaking public process in which everybody who had an interest in oceans could become involved in designing the Marine Reserve Network. And I mean people from all walks of life: fishermen, divers, kayakers, people who just love to go to the ocean, surfers, people from everywhere crowded into meeting rooms and debated what the Marine Protected Area Network should look like. Scientists were at the table, and they had an opportunity to veto proposals that didn't pass muster from a scientific perspective. Tens of thousands of people weighed in over the course of regional stakeholder group meetings, Blue Ribbon Task Force meetings, finally commission meetings where we made our decisions in 4 different regions of the state. It all culminated about 2 years ago with the designation of the last of the sections of the coast, the largest network of marine protected areas anywhere in the nation. And we should all be, as I said before, really, really proud of that. Well, now what are we going to do to implement them? And what it really takes is, eyes on the water. We, the public, designed these marine protected areas. Citizen stakeholder groups mapped them out. Ocean users of all kinds weighed in over the course of dozens of meetings, and now it's our responsibility to make them real. Otherwise, they're just paper parks, and we've seen plenty of those around the world, and we don't want that to be happen here. So the commission that I currently chair has pledged to do what's called adaptive management of these MPAs, and that means that we're going to monitor how they're doing. Are they working? In other words, are they achieving the objectives that we set out for them? Or do we need to make changes? We're going to revisit them about every 5 years or so and talk about, are they big enough? Are they too big? Do they need their boundaries adjusted? And we're going to need to hear from the public. We're going to need to hear from elected officials, from local officials, from scientists, from users about that. In fact, that process has already started. Some of you may have been in Monterey last February at I think it was February 2013, at a major symposium on the first 5 years of MPAs on the Central Coast of California. Very interesting set of results and opportunities for public input. As a result of that, the Commission has already begun making some changes to the MPA network along the coast. We just adopted a cleanup package recently for some minor changes to the MPA network. And here's an example. This guy's carrying a spear gun. Well, the spear fishermen, who were one of the constituent groups that helped design these areas, the spear fishermen complained at a place in Southern California that in order to get to where they could legally spearfish, the only way to get there was to swim across a marine reserve where spearfishing wasn't allowed. And so would we allow them to do that? And at first I thought, well, gee, carrying a spear gun in a marine reserve, the temptation would be too great to resist using it. But the game wardens turned out didn't have a problem with it, so we talked about it and heard from the spear fishermen and everybody else and decided, maybe that's something we can do. Allow spear fishermen to carry unloaded spear guns strapped to their back across a marine reserve to get to where they can use those devices legally. So that's an example of a change that we're going to make from time to time, minor boundary adjustments to make marine reserves easier to recognize, changes like the spearfishing example. But if there are bigger changes that need to be made, we're going to need to know that. And that's what the monitoring effort that you've probably heard about is all about. The state has an MPA monitoring enterprise administered by the Ocean Science Trust, which is working with academic institutions across the state to collect information on how these MPAs are doing. Are they making a difference? Are fish getting bigger inside them? Are they getting more numerous? What's happening to the invertebrates? What's happening to the forage species? All kinds of questions about how to monitor the changes that are happening as a result of setting these areas aside. It's important that we have answers to all of those scientific questions before we make any changes to marine protected areas. So you might ask, why should you care about this? What's in it for my constituency, whether it's a local community or municipality along the coast, a group, an affinity group? Well, it turns out, and we've known this for some time thanks to sophisticated public opinion research, that Californians really love their coast. And I mean overwhelmingly love their coast. The pollsters that collect this information came to us a while back and said, what are you worried about? People love the California coast so much that they're going to vote overwhelmingly to support its protection and to take care of it. Well, of course, that's sometimes wishful thinking. Just because people care about someplace doesn't mean it's automatically protected. People actually have to take action, and that's where communication comes in. It is true that the overwhelming majority, more than 75% of Californians regularly say they care about the ocean, but we have to make sure that they know that it's protected and they actually take an active hand in it. As you know, our oceans are used all the time, even though many people never might go out surfing or scuba diving. They might go fishing. They might participate in something like junior lifeguards, or there are all kinds of ways to use the ocean, either in a consumptive way like spear fishermen or in a non-consumptive way like a birder. So you'd be surprised how many people actually use our ocean: boating, swimming, surfing, paddling, fishing, birding, and so forth. And the ocean, it turns out, is important to people, not just those living on the shore, but those living inland as well. We love to vacation on the oceans. We love to go kayaking off our shore. We managed to protect some areas along the California coast that are akin to the redwood forests of the underwater world, the Yosemites, the underwater Yosemites out here. We finally were able to level the playing field with the land. About 10% of our land surface is protected in one way or another, and now a little bit. More than 10% of our ocean, our coastal ocean, is protected. Remember, California controls out to 3 nautical miles offshore. So what happens in that coastal zone is really a matter for the state to pay attention to, in addition to all the other authorities out there. And, of course, the California coast is not just important because of its attraction to people, because we love the coast. It's important economically, too. Our coast and ocean generates billions, tens of billions of dollars to the California economy. In fact, my favorite statistic that I cite often, that I didn't believe when I first heard it, is that California's ocean and coastal economy is worth more than our agricultural economy. It's hard to believe, but apparently it's true. When you add up all the things that we do on our coast, fishing, tourism, shipbuilding, cable laying, and so forth, the lodging and all the provision of services, it's worth more than our agricultural economy. So we need to take care of our ocean, not just because it's important to the people of California and our visitors here, but because it's important to our economy as well. So thank you for caring about the ocean. Thank you for helping share the messages about how important it is to protect our ocean and the role that marine protected areas can play. And I hope to see you all at a commission meeting sometime soon to tell us how better to manage these areas. I'll turn it back over to Ricky and Nicole.
Nicole, do you want to start with how to actually take these ideas and lessons that Mike has given us and apply them to better communicate about MPA?
But we know that it's an unfamiliar concept to most people, and it becomes particularly hairy when we use acronyms. So the first takeaway that I hope you'll leave this webinar with is that spelling it out is always useful. And I've violated my own advice here on this slide, but I would really encourage you to say marine protected areas as opposed to MPAs, because they're, starting with a series of letters that are meaningless to your audience is one good way to put them off. At Resource Media, as Ricky said, we've been working on marine protected area communications for over a decade. And the advice that we give to the government agencies and scientists and advocates we work with is the same really regardless of issue. You want to meet people where they are. That's rule number 1 of communications. And that could be geographically, so literally starting with a familiar place. Mike talked about Point Lobos and the fact that it's an incredibly popular tourist destination, 400,000 visitors a year. So using that example of the meeting of land and sea and the fact that protections go from ridge to reef is a really powerful visual. As Mike said, Californians love the ocean. 75% of us visit it every single year. And when we visit the ocean, it's really easy to tell whether the beach is clean or dirty. For instance, that's you don't need any special expertise. You don't need a dive mask to determine that. It's harder to tell what's happening underneath the water, and that's where good communications really come into play. And it all starts with education, and I know that we have Aquaria represented here in local government and various groups that do play a public education function. Californians also get that our ocean is a resource that matters to the state, both in terms of quality of life. 70% of Californians, and one of the polls that Mike mentioned, this was a 2006 public opinion research poll, said that it's very important to our quality of life, and 63% said it's super important to our economy. 70% of Californians are in favor of creating marine reserves. California has done that, but I share this tidbit just to say that your audience is very likely to be kindly predisposed to hearing about marine protection. During the 10-year planning process that Mike described, there was overwhelming public engagement on both sides of the issue, but what it really showed is the passion that people have about the ocean. And so communications is really about keying into that passion and starting with a familiar concept as opposed to, the alphabet soup of ocean governance. One metaphor that we've used throughout the process for the past decade or so is the idea of underwater parks. You can't maybe make out the sticker that's on this little girl's shirt, very well, but it says, "My other state park is underwater." As Mike said, people know about our land-based parks because you can walk on them, and we know everyone's very proud that California is the home of Yosemite. Well, we like to talk about the Yosemites of the sea. And when we started using this language, not only did we find that in one-on-one conversations on the shore, it was effective, but it's something that really got traction in the press, and that's a great measure of whether or not the language is simple enough and compelling enough to stick. And here you're just looking at a snapshot of headlines from the planning process for these marine protected areas, and you can see that everyone called them underwater state parks based on the language that we included in our press releases, because they knew that their readers, whether they're living in Santa Barbara or living in Milwaukee, where people are reading the Huffington Post, are familiar with the idea of a state park. So, when you're talking about underwater state parks, introducing the concept is a great start, but we like to have a sort of 4-part story for any communications interaction. And the 4 elements are of value. So we already talked about the fact that Californians care about the ocean. We're going to talk about some of the other values that you can tap into. A problem, so why did we need these things in the first place? Why are they important? What's the threat? Explaining how marine protected areas are part of the solution, how they help improve our ocean health or sustain it. And finally, Mike already mentioned that there are opportunities for the public to weigh in on an ongoing basis. There's also lots of great ways for them to volunteer, whether through your aquaria or through local government groups. And so we like to end with a call to action. So starting with the value, when I'm explaining to a reporter or to another stakeholder about marine protected areas, I'd like to talk first about the places that we love to fish, swim, boat, picnic, et cetera. And depending on where you live, very likely you'll want to name a specific place. The Department of Fish and Game has wonderful maps on their website. So does California MPAs.org, where you can check out a map of your region and notice which are the popular swimming beaches, which are the popular picnic destinations, which are the areas that draw tourists year after year. We'd also like to talk about a way of life for coastal communities, a source of jobs. As Mike mentioned, it's a $39 billion economy. Almost 500,000 people are employed by ocean-related industries. And finally, our responsibility to future generations. So this is a really great thing that California did, and each of us who lives near the shore or visits it has a responsibility to take good care of these places so that our kids can enjoy them too. So the problem, I know that this is something that was covered extensively during the science presentation, but just briefly, I think this is a place where you don't want to necessarily get too into the weeds, but because, again, the ocean is hard to see under, it's helpful, I think, to use visible signs or familiar language. So, talking about the fact that there's more and more development along the coast that's impacting the coastline, or the fact that, there's more demand for fresh seafood, which is impacting our fisheries. Fishermen are catching fewer and smaller fish. You can talk about the fact that a changing climate means warmer seas, more acidic seas, rising sea levels. And then finally, and I know that many of you work on lots of other ocean projects, and so we don't want to say that marine protected areas are the solution. There's lots of great work happening, from mitigating pollution to cleaning up the beaches. But they are one really important step that the state has taken to ensure a healthier ocean for the future. And so here's where we talk about the fact that these are underwater parks that both protect sea life and provide access to nature for people. And if reporters or folks that I'm talking to have questions about what exactly does an underwater park do, I like to talk about protecting breeding and feeding grounds, or areas for fish and shellfish to grow and multiply. When I first started learning about marine protected areas, I think I heard the term BOF, big old fat female fish, or big old fat fertile female fish. This is another concept that was discussed at length, I suspect, in the science webinar. But the idea here is that as many fish grow older, they produce exponentially more babies. And so providing places where they can grow older and reproduce means that there are more and more fish that swim out into open areas where fishermen can catch them. And then finally, the idea that, this is, although Mike talked about how extensive California's marine protected area network is relative to what other states have, it's still a relatively small percentage of the coast. There's lots that's still open to fishing, but these spots were chosen particularly because they are hot spots where there's lots of wildlife, there's lots of plant life, and also most of them are located offshore from public beaches and parks, so there's really easy access for visiting. Final step is inviting people to get involved. And there's a scale from just enjoying them responsibly, leaving no trace, taking nothing except for photos, to citizen science programs. I know many of your organizations are involved in programs like Reef Check that trains volunteer divers to survey underwater areas, or Lampe or Beach Watch or MPA Watch. And then finally, volunteer events. And I'm going to show you shortly that the website that Danielle and Ricky help maintain tracks some of these volunteer events. So that's a good resource. I like to emphasize what is allowed and enhanced by marine protected areas rather than what's restricted. So you know that if you live near the coast, you've probably seen the regulatory signs. It is important to communicate the rules, but for most of our conversations about marine protected areas, I think most users, we know from usage research, are not fishermen. They are going to the coast to watch birds and wildlife, to spend time with their family, to picnic, et cetera. And so I like to emphasize that these are allowed activities. These aren't no-go zones. In fact, they're really wonderful places to experience the ocean, to learn about it, to see wildlife. And I think it's important to communicate that openness and that the opportunities for recreation and education in photos. So it's tempting, I think, for many ocean groups to showcase the spectacular wildlife that we have underwater. And I love underwater photos like this Garibaldi in the kelp forest, because a lot of people have never dived or even snorkeled, perhaps. And so it's fascinating to see what's underneath the surface of a tide pool or a kelp forest or a submarine canyon. But I like to pair those wildlife photos with photos of people using the ocean to just reinforce the message that you can go there and there's a lot of great things to see even above the surface. Speaking of visuals, I want to give a shout out to Ocean Conservancy, which developed this wonderful graphic to sort of communicate at a glance the difference between a marine protected area and an unprotected area. So again, the idea is that by setting aside this area and protecting it, you're going to see more kelp, more fish, and eventually a healthier ocean overall. Monterey Bay Sanctuary Foundation has also developed some nice graphics. Those, again, are found on their website. And in general, there's just a lot of great interpretive work happening up and down the coast. The county, there are a series of collaboratives, marine protected area collaboratives in the counties that are developing interpretive signs and PowerPoint decks and brochures and frequently asked question handouts. And so wherever you're located, it's very likely that you can tap into those groups. As I said, CaliforniaMPAs.org, which is probably familiar to most of you since you found your way onto this webinar, has a ton of education and interpretive resources. And they also have a lot of family-friendly resources, from activities to do with kids to events to geocaching. In case you didn't know, there are a number of geocaches located in alongside the MPAs, so shore side. You don't have to go get wet to get them. And geocaching is just exploding in popularity. I recently was hiking with my boss in Montana, and all of a sudden he whips out his smartphone and says, "Hey, I think there's a geocache in this area," and totally caught me by surprise. But he said, "Hey, everyone's doing it in Seattle." So lots of ways to sort of draw people in And then once you have them at the shore and they're excited about the place, then you can take that moment to educate them about the fact that the protections don't stop at the high tide line. They actually extend out into the water. You've probably seen, so in addition to those regulatory signs that, are really designed to communicate the rules, there are lots of wonderful interpretive signs. I was at Point Lobos recently with my husband and, was so excited to see a bunch of people standing around, signs like this, reading about the protections underwater, and also the wildlife that is being protected. And finally, there are brochures, and these you can download from CaliforniaMPAs.org. One for, I think, Ricky or Danielle, correct me, is there one for every site in California, or are the regions not quite complete yet?
No, they're primarily, there's a lot for the Central Coast and the North Central Coast, and depending on what the collaboratives and other people who are interested in either working and developing additional MPA templates like these, we can certainly help provide access to those resources. Great.
Thank you. And before I depart from the idea of materials, I want to say I neglected to mention when I was on this earlier slide that Ocean Conservancy also has a really great video called How Do You MPA that, again, emphasizes the idea that these are places that are wonderful to visit, that offer a range of activities. So no need to reinvent the wheel if you are in the South Coast or the North Coast where the marine protected areas were designated more recently and you don't have as many materials. Lots of groups have already started that process. So where to talk about MPAs? Again, I know we have a sort of very diverse crowd on this webinar, so the context will depend a bit on where you work. But I think there are lots of different opportunities from printed materials to your own website and newsletter and social media sites to tours. When this back years ago during the Central Coast process, I worked with the folks from Monterey Bay Sanctuary Foundation on talking points for whale watch tour guides who, they're not going to spend the entire boat tour talking about marine protected areas, but it's, totally appropriate for them as they're passing into the boundary to say, and now we're in an underwater park. And then, around decision points, Mike mentioned the Central Coast Symposium last year that sort of celebrated the 5-year anniversary of the Central Coast protected areas and also, looked at existing, the initial monitoring data. Around those big milestones, it's really wonderful to have local government groups and interpretive groups, volunteer and community groups weigh in and talk about their experience living alongside supporting a marine protected area. So you can do that through letters to the editor, or if your organization happens to get a phone call, of course, that's another opportunity. And aside from those big milestones that might be like an anniversary of the marine protected area designation, there's World Oceans Day, which just happened, June 8th. There's also a holiday in January that the Aquaria community started, Underwater Parks Day, and it's really, I believe it was started in Southern California, but it was a day to just educate visitors about, even during the planning process, about the idea of creating underwater parks and ways to get involved. And my assumption is that it's going to continue in 2015, and I know that it has spread throughout the state now. So that's a great opportunity to remind people that these exist and to promote any volunteer opportunities that you have going on. Finally, as I said, the county marine protected area collaboratives are doing fantastic work. I have been tracking the work of San Diego Collaborative most closely because this is a photo from San Diego, but they've been doing everything from installing signs to leading tours, both tours for the public on the shore, and in Santa Barbara they recently had a fishing trip for local anglers to talk about the boundaries and the rules. So lots of great work happening there. I want to close with just a few reminders, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A. And as Ricky said at the beginning, I think Danielle has been collecting your questions via chat throughout. And so if you have any questions that haven't yet made it into chat, I would encourage you to put them in now. So my top communications tips are to Start with the value, so connect with people around something they already know and care about. Explain why we need ocean protection, so some of the threats that are facing our ocean, and then explain how marine protected areas help. So that's the value problem solution formula. Use familiar language and concepts, so rather than leading with a bunch of acronyms, I think the idea of underwater parks tends to resonate. Put people in the picture, both literally and when you're talking. Focus on the benefits and results, not the process. So Mike talked a bit about the Marine Life Protection Act initiative. It's great to emphasize the fact that these parks were designed by local citizens with guidance from scientists, but I don't think that we need to go in depth into the planning process. Let's talk about what we got out of it. Invite your audience to get involved. So many of you are already at the forefront of that public engagement piece, whether it's monitoring or volunteerism. And then finally, take advantage of existing resources. I know that Ricky and Danielle are constantly updating CaliforniaMPAs.org, and groups like Ocean Conservancy and NRDC and the Water Keepers in California have great resources as well. And that will wrap it up for me. So I will invite Danielle or Ricky to weigh in with questions.
Yes. Thank you so much. Both Mike Sutton and Nicole Lampe. Mike walked us through, for those of you who came on last minute, on sort of why it's important to communicate, and then Nicole gave us an excellent overview on how you actually communicate. And this is, just for those of you who weren't on at the beginning, the third in a webinar that's focused on communicating about marine protected areas, and we've called out some of the resources. The www.californiampas.org is one resource, but we have people from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, the Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary, and the Cabrillo Aquarium. California has many experts in ocean communications and ocean conservation. There are a variety of resources out there statewide. This was intended to kind of give you a little bit of a primer and give you some of the information and resources for where you can get more content on how to tailor your marine protected areas outreach and communication. Following the webinar today, we will be sending out a link for all of you with information on how you can, all of the webinars are actually being uploaded to YouTube. And the idea for all of these webinars is that you can actually present these to, some of you are county parks representatives or harbor masters, that these are actually a packet that you can use for your staff, for your elected officials, to your Rotary Club, so that you have kind of a packet of the basics about marine protected areas. So we'll be sending out that link for all of you to have access to the webinars as a packet, as well as an evaluation. And at this time, if anybody has questions, I'm going to go over those questions.
I've gotten a couple of questions from Danielle via chat. So first, Cindy asked why there hasn't been more focus on describing marine protected areas as an insurance policy to ensure that ocean areas are protected from management missteps and increasing stressors. And that is something, actually, Cindy, that we tried throughout the planning process to use the idea of an insurance policy. It may have resonated with members of the public. It's certainly not something that we saw reflected back in media coverage. So I think depending on your audience, if that's something that you think an idea, and you may by all means try it out and let us know. Actually, I would love feedback. But the two other sort of metaphors that we used in addition to underwater parks were an insurance policy, and also we talked about three actually. We talked about preventative care, the power and the relative affordability of preventative care versus triage later. We also tried to talk about this ocean's a savings account for the ocean and the fact that they pay dividends and interest. I think all of those are really great ways to communicate to more sophisticated audience how marine protected areas work and benefit us. But I think starting really basic with the idea of underwater parks is a good idea. But thanks for flagging that. I think those are all good terms. Sean asked how best to talk to the recreational fishing community. So I have to admit that Resource Media does not frequently interact with the recreational fishing community, but I know that we work with lots of groups that do, like the MPA collaboratives and the monitoring enterprise, and have recently been working with the Santa Barbara MPA collaborative that includes some recreational fishing representatives. And I think, depending right now, it depends a bit on the audience, but I think that the message that a lot of MPA collaboratives are using is, hey, we all agreed to set aside these places. The fishing community was very much at the table during the planning process, and now it's all of our responsibility to communicate the rules and to make sure that we're observing them, and then the monitoring data is going to tell us how well they're working. The other thing that we talked about, more broadly, maybe not specifically to fishermen, is this is about protecting the future of fishing. There's lots and lots of research. I'm happy to send you some links that shows that, overall, there are some famous case studies like abalone and groundfish, but that, some of California's fisheries are in trouble, and many of them we don't know how really the status. We don't have a ton of information. And so this is a precautionary approach to make sure that there are still fish to catch, lots of big fish for years to come. Let's see what else. Diane flagged that the Department of Fish and Wildlife doesn't like the underwater parks term. We know that. If you're speaking to a Department of Fish and Wildlife representative, perhaps marine protected areas is the appropriate term. When you're speaking to members of the general public, I would say underwater parks is immensely valuable. So I think we've sort of we are aware of their official stance and have found that it's still so useful. Let's see.
We have a question that maybe if Mike is still on the line, we have a question, will there be a 10-year report and presentation on the Channel Islands network of marine protected areas?
Yeah, good question. Many of you may have been at there was a symposium in Ventura in 2008 on the first 5 years of the Channel Islands Marine Reserves. You'll recall that the reserves around the northern Channel Islands off Santa Barbara were established in 2003 by the Commission prior to the MLPA process. So they predate the MLPA process, but they're obviously related, and the MLPA initiative did not make any changes to those marine reserves around the Channel Islands. So they're the longest lived reserves off the California coast, and except for the small pre-existing ones. So they're the ones that we have the most experience monitoring and the longest in the water. I suspect we will see a 10-year symposium about what we've learned in the first decade of those marine reserves. Because they're islands and because they have species like lobsters, we're actually seeing a lot happen very quickly there. So lobsters being relatively short-lived species compared to something like a rockfish. So stay tuned. I think we're going to all be really interested to see what the first 10 years will have brought.
Nicole, do you want to take the next question?
Sure. Is that the one from Lisa about the kelp forest narrations?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So I think this is can you talk more about the legacy language? So Lisa from, I'm not sure actually where you're from, Lisa, says we've retooled our kelp forest narrations over the past year to use marine protected areas and underwater parks as the overarching theme. Both the volunteer presenters and the public have responded very well. The legacy aspect gets lots of response. Can you talk more about legacy language? So legacy is just one of the terms that we use sort of interchangeably with things like protecting this for future generations, our shared natural heritage, our ocean, wealth. So I think the idea, though, and there's lots and lots of polling to back this up, that we are very fortunate to live in this beautiful place with such a, rich coastline, and that means we have a responsibility to protect it, is something that resonates with audiences. And so, when we talk about the fact that California has taken this bold step and that we all have a role to play in ensuring that these marine protected areas work and that our ocean remains healthy, we tend to get positive response, especially when you pair that with opportunities to get involved. Lisa's from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, by the way.
Hold on, we're getting another question coming in. For those of you, feel free to chat, Danielle, your questions. We're trying to synthesize those as quickly as possible and get them to the right person.
Just got another question forwarded to me from Danielle.
Okay.
Is there a benefit to linking marine protected area education with other coastal protected areas like areas of special biological significance, especially where they overlap, or will that confuse the message? By all means. So, and Casey added that in Malibu, our 2 marine protected areas are both within our area of special biological significance. I think, as Mike mentioned at the very beginning, there are lots and lots of designations on land and in the sea that are meaningful to, policymakers and to the agencies that are tasked with management. I think to members of the public, the particular designation is not so important. So I think that, sure, talk about the broader context of what Malibu is doing to safeguard its ocean, but I think that getting into terms like an area of special biological significance and marine protected areas could be confusing. So I would just talk about the fact that, we have really unusual and sensitive habitat out here that we're monitoring closely and that we're managing very carefully to make sure that we can all continue to enjoy it. And there are 2 underwater parks in particular that have, sort of special status. So I try to avoid the alphabet soup and just sort of talk more broadly about the goal of the protections and the significance for my audience. So depending on your audience, it might be important to clarify the designation and clarify the rules, but for some recreational users, it won't be.
Okay, we have another question from someone from the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Do we have data on the Hopkins Marine Reserve since it was set aside in the 1930s? That could be really powerful. And Mike, I don't know if you know the answer to that. I've certainly seen some early presentations, but if you want to take a stab at that, and if we don't have the answer, we'll certainly get everyone an answer on follow-up.
Yeah, good point. We do have data collected by Stanford graduate students, of all people, on the Hopkins Marine Reserves. The only trouble with the Hopkins Marine Reserves is that they've been around a long time, but they're very small. I mean, you can throw a rock across them, and they fish the heck out of squid and sardines right offshore. As people who are looking all the nights this week will have seen those light boats very active right offshore. So the problem with the reason that we initiated the MLPA process a decade ago is that the marine reserves that were in California before then were fragmented and tiny. And so while they've been there a long time and we can draw some limited local conclusions, we really needed a statewide network of biologically functioning marine reserves to say that we were contributing to the conservation of the entire coastal marine ecosystem.
Great. Thank you, Mike. We're going to let Sean Hastings now has an answer, actually in response. No? Okay. So Paul Hobie from the Community Collaborative, the representative, had a question about the Community Collaborative. So we're going to unmute Paul and hear him for a second. Paul, can you unmute yourself? bear with us while we get Paul access to the microphone. Paul, maybe you could, we can't seem to be able to unmute you. If you could chat me your question, I'm happy to say, you can just send us what you want us to communicate. Are there other questions from anybody? No, with that, I'd like to thank all of you for taking an hour out of your busy day to spend with us on communicating marine protected areas. Like I said, we'll be sending out the full set of the webinars, and all of these will be uploaded onto the California MPA's website and available as a YouTube. So please feel free to use them or share with others. The idea is to actually get these out. Paul has sent me a chat that says that make all of you aware that the Marine Protected Area community collaboratives are meeting in each of California's coastal counties. And for more information about attending a collaborative meeting in your area, to contact Paul. His address will actually send out this information as well in the email to everyone. It'll have information for how you can join one of these community collaboratives in your area. Thank you all very much, and we look forward to any feedback from you in the future. Bye-bye.